I'm John Mooney and welcome to The Dark State. This podcast is brought to you through the generous financial support of our subscribers on Patreon and Apple Podcasts. If you wish to contribute and gain access to more exclusive episodes, please do subscribe. And now, on with the show. They haven't gone away, you know. Loyalist paramilitaries are making their presence felt once again. The UDA, the UVF and the Red Hand Commando are united in their opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol. They say it weakens the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This week we return to the subject of loyalist terrorism. Are they still a threat? And could we see the emergence of a new dissident loyalist group in the coming months? I'm John Mooney. Welcome to The Dark State. To discuss this topic, I am joined by Dr. Aaron Edwards from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. Aaron, welcome to The Dark State.
Thank you for having me, John.
Aaron, could I ask you the following? Where are loyalist paramilitary groups at the moment following the introduction of the Northern Ireland Protocol?
I think loyalist paramilitaries are going through a period of transition at the moment. For the past few years, they've been involved in this process whereby they have been committed to the peace process, where they have been committed to the transition of their members beyond paramilitarism. This is the sort of language that they've been using. And unfortunately, events have intervened, and we've seen with Brexit and Northern Ireland Protocol a bit of a vote fast for some loyalist paramilitary groups. So what I mean by that is that, of course, they are in public, they are committed to the peace process, but in private, it's clear that they are trying to mop up some disaffection in their own areas, these areas that they have controlled in terms of territory, in terms of people, for many, many years, for decades. And so we are in a very interesting situation where publicly they are committed to observing, peace and monitoring the peace and ensuring that their members do not involve themselves in paramilitary activity. In the main, attacking the other community. In the main, engaging in murder and maiming and mayhem. But that doesn't mean that they are not engaged in other activities. So what we are seeing is the resurgence almost of loyalist paramilitary groups in trying to exert control and to gain control over these mounting protests that we see against the Northern Ireland Protocol. So we see loyalist paramilitaries almost becoming relevant again because the political climate has ensured that they have new life breathed into them.
Have they become factionalised? Is there competing leaderships vying for control of these organisations?
Well, the short answer is yes, but the longer answer is they've always been factionalised, and we tend to see loyalist paramilitary groups according to hierarchies. In fact, we look at most groups in Ireland and elsewhere according to hierarchies, and that they have a leadership, and the leadership keeps the coherence of the message to the members, the ideology there. It's it's a custodian almost of that, that the membership renews itself. I mean, these groups haven't gone away in almost 30 years since the ceasefires. They have maintained a presence. It's not simply the case that it is full of older men and some older women. It's actually the case that we have teenagers in these groups now today in 2021, which suggests that they have maintained their presence not only in their own areas, in their respective areas. There's plenty of evidence there to suggest that they are recruiting, that they are maintaining a presence, that they are engaging in community policing, but not on the level, surely, of the Troubles. However, I think that it's important to recognise that the security environment has fundamentally changed in the past 25 to 30 years, and loyalist paramilitary groups have changed with it, and that means that some of the leadership, some of the members, it's impossible to know how many, are involved in organised crime, or what would pass as organised crime in other parts of the world. But I think that it's more complex than that. I think that the security environment, globalization, has meant that these groups have had to adapt and survive, and they've had to compete with new groups that have emerged, new transnational organised crime groups. And that means that these old groups actually, not only do they have the surety of the support in certain pockets, of particularly working class deprived areas, but that they actually exert control over other groups, and we've plenty of evidence there. It's covered by journalists such as yourself about how they tax drug dealers, how they actually engage in what would pass for extortion, protection rackets. So they are doing the things that they always used to do, but they're doing new things as well. And I think that that's an important point to make, actually, as we look at these groups today, that if the security environment has changed, it's not the case that they have remained the same. They have adapted as well.
You're painting a very complex picture there. Do the leaders of these various groups or entities, do they see themselves as political or criminal? Do they see themselves as supporters of political institutions, or do they see themselves as groups that tolerate this, but as long as they can continue with their more criminal activities?
Well, I think it's important to reiterate, what we have seen in the media. Publicly, they remain political. They are committed to the peace process, yet they tolerate in private these activities that in any part of the world would be designated as criminal activity. So it's a very complex picture, because I think these people are very complex. It's certainly the case that at the very top, they remain committed to the peace process. They remain committed to the political process, but that they are existing in a very grey place, a very unusual space, that they haven't had much of a raison d'etre for 25 years since they called a halt to their campaigns, and then since 2009 when the UVF and UDA disarmed, and when they committed themselves to going out of business. I mean, they've remained there. They've actually recruited younger members. So the logic that they follow themselves, I think, is quite unusual, and some would say it's illogical or irrational. That on the one hand they can be committed to politics, they can demand. We've heard them regularly on the airwaves through spokespeople saying that if the police have evidence, then they should arrest those engaged in criminality. It's not as simple as that. Being in a paramilitary organisation is an illegal thing. It's an illegal pursuit. It's a minority sport, and it's very difficult to designate someone as being in a paramilitary group unless they avow themselves as being a member of that group. So we live in a very grey area, and that's why it's difficult to really say anything with concrete certainty. And that leaves us in a quite a vulnerable place. I think society unfortunately sees these groups operating. They are still there. I was back in Belfast just a few weeks ago, and it's evident that these groups exist, that they are still operating on various levels. So they haven't gone out of business, and that begs the question, what is their purpose today? And I think that if we look at the Northern Ireland Protocol, we see them slowly regaining some of that lost raison d'etre, and that's very dangerous, I think, for society as we try to move beyond the Troubles.
Are these groups subculture within Northern Ireland society? This is something I'm personally very interested in. I often wonder, have these terrorist organisations mutated into something else that's not fully understood? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a great way to put it. I think they have mutated, and I think that they have, unfortunately, become very difficult to control. The state, whereas the state in all of this, the state and its intelligence and security agencies, the police, law enforcement, they have been battling against these groups for years now. And I think that, unfortunately, as we sit in this centennial year of Northern Ireland, it's difficult not to make comparisons with the early years of the Northern Ireland state and the Craig government, where at the formation of Northern Ireland itself, these groups existed. Unfortunately, they went under different headings, the Ulster Protestant Association, Empire Loyalists, and so on. There were several of them. There were local vigilante groups that were formed in places like Armagh and elsewhere. And, we see these types of groups exist throughout history. And the state is always trying to wrest control from them because they do control small, very localized areas. So what the old Stormont government did was it simply recruited them into the Ulster Special Constabulary and tried to channel that vigilanteism, that idea of taking the law into your own hands, to try and channel that in a more lawful direction. And I think that it's been said by a number of commentators that essentially what happened in the 1970s again was that that was seeded almost either through bad decision making or deliberately actually to some of these groups, where they then held ground, held territory and people in their grip for many, many years. So actually these groups, they exist almost as a shadow state, in certain pockets. I'm not saying this is the case as it's throughout Northern Ireland, of course it's not, but I think that we do see them emboldened in very marginalised areas, and they have a profile there. It is, as you said, rightly, it's a subculture, and that subculture isn't very well understood. I think that there's quite a lot of factors that go into producing that subculture, but there's no doubt in my mind it's there. It's there not only in the symbolism on the walls, but in the discourse of everyday life.
It's funny you say that, because I see the same thing happening within dissident republicanism, where a lot of people who are becoming involved in that, it's never quite clear why they're doing that, what prompts them to engage in that. And I'm not entirely convinced it's all political. Sometimes I think it provides them with status within their communities. And other times I think it's just tradition. It's that people from certain communities, families, backgrounds, that they are drawn towards these secret organizations because that's what is culturally acceptable within their communities. And it's something that I've often feel is very much overlooked in all of this, that maybe there's some overemphasis placed on the terrorist aspect of these groups and their political leanings, rather than something else that maybe isn't quite defined or clearly understood. I don't know whether you agree with me on that, but it's just, as a bystander watching this on both sides of the community in Northern Ireland, it can sometimes be very clear and very obvious when you stand back and look at it.
Yeah, and I think that, if we break it down into very simple language, it's like role models that you see in various walks of life in different parts of the world. They will all look very different. Some may have celebrity status, some will be very local and based on, a street or a housing estate. And, these people are very popular in very localized circumstances, in environments where there isn't really that many life opportunities for younger people. And unfortunately, the first thing I did when I saw rioting take place, in my local area yet again, at Clockfern Corner, and just outside North Belfast there, I looked at actually some of the demographics, and it's really sad to see that it's not just the demographics, but it's deprivation. We're talking about life opportunities really for young people, and they're, in certain respects, they're absent, and those life opportunities, and so they find excitement, they find, as I've said, they find role models to look up to. I mean, it's a very social dynamic. You would find it in other places, but unfortunately it takes on a political connotation in the north. And also, that the groups themselves are quite powerful, and they are powerful. They can, in many respects, they hold, life and death, and the power of one individual, one local commander, for example, could decide to have someone exiled. Now, I mean, this is all very interesting, I think, from an academic perspective, but I was reminded earlier this year of a friend from school who told me that, business that he worked for had gone out of business because, not because of the pandemic, not because of austerity over the years it's battered local businesses, but because a local loyalist paramilitary group decided that they had done an investigation They're almost comic-like, Clouseau-like, and they've done an investigation. They found that someone who had worked or allegedly worked in that local business was dealing drugs. I wonder if it was simply that he hadn't been paying his protection money, or he refused to be taxed by that Loyalist paramilitary group. Whatever the case, that person then had to leave or be shot in the leg or have something else happen to him, and the business it folded after that. So this is having a very localized impact, I think, and it's difficult for us to see that in the national headlines because it's not of much interest to people in other parts of the world. But as I've said, once you sort of connect these local incidents and the impact up, you find actually quite a patchwork quilt of a broken society and a place that really has difficulties moving beyond paramilitarism because it's just a way of life.
What you're describing there is almost a mafia-like organisation, and I can't help but think of people that live in Sicily, and they would view the Cosa Nostra in the same light, as it's an organisation that they can go to resolve disputes, but that organisation can turn on them and kill them and inflict awful injuries through the use of violence against them. What is the standing of these groups within the Loyalist community? And when I say Loyalist community, I mean the working class, good Protestant people of Northern Ireland. What way are they generally regarded by law-abiding citizens up there?
Well, I think we have mixed feelings there. I mean, it would be very easy for me to say one way or another. It's they're feared, or they're hated. But I think it's a mix of both. I actually have come across people who have said once those paramilitary groups disband, there will be a queue up that street for people to wreak revenge on some of these paramilitary godfathers for what they have done to their own community. I mean, that's another factor. I think it's very important to see what's happening in Northern Ireland in that light, because these people have been around and empowered, and in some respects, actually, when you see the peace process and what's happened there, the peace process itself has actually empowered some of these people and given them titles, or given them, stature, I should say, more than titles, and has actually paid for some of these people to live almost split personality lives, driven lives. So on one hand, they are, some sort of community leader savior, and on the other hand, they are a paramilitary thug. So, and they exist in the same person, and that's what a lot of people find very difficult to understand. But that they have, a face for the community, they have a face for the media, they've different faces for different people, but what we're talking about is the same beast, and yes, it engages in organised crime, occasionally engages in community policing, with inverted commas, that the horrible sort of way of maiming and murdering people within their own community, to establish that kind of stature. I think it's underestimated, and it's often dismissed. And I think, to look at that really in all its horrible glory, I think is important, because we see that they aren't going out of business anytime soon, despite the commitments they've given. One of the repeated lines I've heard, narratives over the past 2 decades, has been, we need assistance, we need help to transform. And when they're given help to transform, they don't take it. So I question really not only the motives, but the willingness, I suppose, of these groups to actually willingly go out of business. I don't think that they are going to disappear overnight. And what I see unfolding at the present moment is that the groups are trying to wrest control of these spontaneous protest movements and channel that in a more orderly fashion, which can be useful, I think, in terms of state agencies and how they try to, control these groups and keep them stable. But also, I think that it can have really unfortunate consequences for the people who live in those areas.
Is there a danger of a new dissident loyalist paramilitary group emerging from the opposition to the Northern Ireland Protocol and this wider protest movement against that?
That's a great question, and I think it's an important question. How I would answer that is I would urge people to think about this in terms of extremism and terrorism. Now, it's not universally accepted by academics that the idea of extremists and terrorists can be broken down and separated. But I think what we see around the Northern Ireland Protocol is a lot of extremism. I would use the term radicalisation, but that's not something that is accepted by, say, for example, Police Service of Northern Ireland. I think they would probably balk at the use of the term radicalisation. But nevertheless, what we see is almost like a pyramid where someone starts off on one side of it, they move to the top, they become increasingly more extreme, and then they move down the other side of this first pyramid and up to the top of the second one. And the second one is about terrorism. And I think once people move up to that point, it's a point of no return, and that's where they engage in terrorism. I think we can debate where people are on the two pyramids model, but essentially there's an awful lot of extremism happening there. The big question is, will that translate into active terrorism? So will we see hoax, bomb threats? Will we see bomb attacks? Will we see shootings? What will we see? How will that manifest itself in a violent manner? I think that it's anyone's guess how that might happen. But I think that what loyalists have had to, and those who have become radicalised have had to try and work out in their own minds, is who they should be directing that negative energy towards, and that not only the disaffection, but also that the hatred, the venom, the stuff that really does matter for people when they take that step and they become a terrorist problem. So I think that we are somewhere in the middle at the moment, and it will be interesting to see what form that takes. I would suggest, if you're looking for a kind of form, what way might terrorism take, I think that the first question is to ask, who are they going to direct it against? And the sort of language, the radical language, the extreme language I'm hearing from some loyalists is that Dublin is to blame. And that is, something that you would have probably heard in the 1990s, actually, throughout the Troubles. If young impressionable people can be made to think of a target and direct that energy towards, then we have no idea really how they will set off on that path. I would suspect that, actually, having looked at a number of groups around the world, that we already see, we are probably behind the scenes, have no access to intelligence from state agencies, but I would imagine that the police on both sides of the border, so to speak, are looking at individuals, persons of interest, and where they are meeting, what they are discussing, and also what they are talking about in terms of how they will make that terrorist campaign a reality. Now, we see that in relation to dissident Republicans. I don't think we can totally rule it out in relation to loyalists, and I wouldn't necessarily refer to them as dissident loyalists. I think militant loyalists might be a better term, and the reason why I say that is I just don't think that we are going to see the creation of a new group. I think we're going to see what we saw in the 1990s, which is a fragmentation of the bigger loyalist groups. We're going to see like-minded people getting together and plotting. Now, whether that moves beyond simply talking and extremism, as I've said, it's anyone's guess.
But who could they attack? I mean, their background has been involved in primarily carrying out attacks on Republicans and people from the nationalist community. Surely they would understand that if they were engaged in that type of activity, they would become complete pariahs within society, within Northern Ireland, and it would possibly erode some of their support. Or am I mistaken in assuming that?
No, I think that they are pariahs in relation to the unionist community generally. I did say at the outset it's a minority sport. I think terrorism is a minority sport, and I know that we do see a lot of people kind of supporting this in Ireland, turning up at murals and supporting what might be considered to be a more violent sort of ideology. But I think that we're really talking about small numbers of people here. The term that was used in relation to dissident Republicans for a long time was micro groups. They are very small in number. They are pariahs. They don't care. They really don't, understand, I think, the broader political kind of machinations, the geopolitics, or anything else connected to this. So all they will see is what they have been fed. So I think that it's important to look at the kind of social media driven narratives out there. They facilitate people to engage in terrorism quicker than anything else. I think those narratives, once they start joining the dots, people will finish that process in their own heads, even if it's very simplistic. They aren't exactly, we can compare the sorts of people who engage in militant loyalist or Republican activities with other groups around the world. We see a certain sort of socioeconomic, they emerge from a certain socioeconomic position in society. Generally speaking, they aren't, that well educated because there is a structural disadvantage in that community. We can put together a kind of a broad profile, but generally I think that the people who will emerge will be those people who, if they engage in violent activity, will be considered, the lowest of the low in that society, in that community anyway. And that's a sad thing, really, because we're seeing quite vulnerable people, disaffected people. They are willingly buying into this without questioning what they're being fed by the media or by, nefarious actors and the cyber domain. So, unfortunately, that's where we are at. I can't say anything with any greater certainty than that, other than there are disaffected people in paramilitary organisations, and the big question is, will they take that next step and form another group or carry out attacks like we saw in the early 2000s under the flag of convenience of the Red Hand Defenders? A lot of attacks in the late 1990s attributed to the LVF. They weren't actually the LVF. UVF and UDA were engaged in murder and maiming and attacks, and law enforcement simply just did not attribute it to them. So I think that there is a lot of confusion, complexity, but I do believe that the social dynamic there will be the same. You will find younger people being groomed by older people, quite in a similar way to what we see in terms of dissident republicanism. And I think that younger, more impressionable people, disaffected people in those loyalist areas will look up to older men typically, and it's the older men that we probably need to keep an eye on, because it's the sort of narratives that they are feeding to the younger people that facilitate this terrorism.
If you were advising the Irish and the British government on what measures to take to try maybe contain this or to offset any potential security problems, what would you say to them?
Well, I guess in light of my new book, which is Agents of Influence, I think that human intelligence really can only go so far. So in terms of meeting this with a security response, you've got human sources in these groups, covert human intelligence sources in these groups, undoubtedly in these groups at the top, middle, and the bottom, and that is one way of doing it. But it's not a strategy. I mean, that's just a method. I think that leaderships have a tendency to tell people in government of what they want to hear, and I think that what we've seen with this sort of slight outbreak of violence back in April was that this can sometimes come from the bottom. So I think that it's important to analyse what's going on in those areas from the bottom up rather than the top down. And I suppose in terms of bringing this to an end, the only way you can really deal with extremism is through a developmental agenda as well as a security one. So that would mean that we do have to essentially take away the variables that give rise to extremism and terrorism in the first place. And unfortunately, it's so seeped into the culture in Northern Ireland that is a very difficult thing to do. You're talking about unravelling, many decades, years of groups, paramilitary groups, terrorist groups, call them what you will, weaving themselves into the social fabric of society. So I think that it's a big challenge, but certainly security-wise, you might take certain people out of the equation. They might end up in prison, but that doesn't necessarily deal with the problem. And I think that political leadership, power sharing, working, and actually working for people at the bottom of society as well as those in the middle and the top, it's the only way really forward to, taking the wind out of the sails of this violence or prospective violence.
And that concludes today's edition of The Dark State. If you enjoyed this episode, we would appreciate